Have with us to talk about these perceptions, Dr. Eric Schmeller from Tennessee State University. Dr. Schmeller, what we'd like to do today, as we promised during the end of the first segment, is to really talk about the issue of race itself, which is to say that, and I think a good place to start would be Columbus's voyage to the New World in 1492. And so let's look at these various cultures coming together and how this issue of difference, you see, but the racial difference, our colors and et cetera, played an important part in the history of race and et cetera. Let's do it from that perspective.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, obviously, when Columbus arrived, that how he perceived the Native Americans would change over time. But the early Spanish and Portuguese contact with Africa and the use of African labor definitely kind of influenced that. And the kind of perception of inferiority of one race over another, I mean, it's got a longer history than even with Columbus. And in my book, I kind of discuss a little bit about something called the Great Chain of Being, which has a longer history back to the era of antiquity, when we were trying to place a reason we were here, created a hierarchical order of, man's up, well, obviously God was on top, angels, man, plants, all the way down to rocks and minerals. And when the Renaissance came, and obviously the rebirth of learning and ultimately leading to exploration, there was a renewed interest in the Great Chain of Being. And this chain of being, as we discussed with race, early 18th century, when there's contact now with these new races from the European point of view. Suddenly we have contact regularly with Africans, these new people in this new world that we don't really know who they are, where they came from. There was a renewed interest in the Great Chain of Being, particularly, obviously, in the mankind part. Let's try and break that down even further, in other words, to put it in an overall larger scheme. And I guess the science, we call them scientists, but the race science of the time was definitely an effort here to classify, measure body parts from different people. We have things like cranial capacity and facial structure. And two of the earliest people, Carl Linnaeus and Blumenbach, basically kind of divided, came up with the concept of Caucasian, the people that are white and come from the Caucasus Mountains originally, the Negroid races, the Indio races, the Mongoloid, the Chinese, in other words. In this early period, you don't see the kind of, just obviously putting it in a structure, that these races are different. Not specifically, you don't see it until a little bit later that obviously the Caucasian seems to kind of creep up to the top, that's the race that has moved ahead of the others. But definitely with settlement, Jamestown and the early kind of Americans, and the use of indentured servants, when that became too expensive and slavery became more cost efficient, that Great Chain of Being kind of came back into play, and it started to kind of justify, why are we keeping these people as slaves? It's because they're inferior racially. And they would point back to this science to defend it. Thomas Jefferson was one of the first to kind of jump on this kind of bandwagon in his notes on Virginia, is kind of arguing that there's a clear reason that we do this. There were other voices that disagreed with him.
But he led, not only as an intellectual, Thomas Jefferson sort of led the way in reference to that, did he not?
Yeah, usually he's one of our, I mean, as an actual kind of printed source, we have Jefferson to kind of, this is what he was writing about. There were other voices, but Jefferson's obviously kind of stands out usually the most on this. And obviously the hypocrisy that students, mine and I'm sure yours too, find that Jefferson, the man who writes about the inferiority of the black race intellectually, didn't have a problem with that when it came to his own personal relations.
Very good. And so in a real sense, this whole idea of race sort of predated Columbus's voyage to the New World, but there was no negative impact. It was a recognition that races were different.
Yes.
But there was no, at this particular time, there was no assumption that one race was superior or inferior to the other. Now, how did this attitude come into being?
It seems to come with, I mean, it's a long kind of, well, not maybe so long, but it's a slow process. And it seems, even when you just look at Columbus's journals, I mean, at first, his descriptions of the Native Americans, they're healthy, they're big, they're clean, and there are some elements of that negative kind of tones in there, and it increases the longer they're there. To justify why we're there is definitely kind of one thing to think about. The English, when they come over, some elements of the Native American culture, they definitely kind of see this as a good thing, but other elements, they can be pretty negative. And yeah, the racist part of the race seems to kind of gradually come with settlement. The longer we're here, it seems to get a little worse. And problems in the Americas definitely influence it as well. To jump forward to Andrew Jackson's era, that's as slavery is getting truly established, the cotton expansion, and we're having some slave revolts, Nat Turner's big slave revolt. There's a real effort to, we've got to define kind of blacks as inferior. There's a reason they are slaves. They are animal-like, and we need to keep them down and give them the benefits of our culture. So,
you know, one of the things that we find in dealing with this issue of race is that if you look in the Caribbean, the French, for example, would have a different attitude toward what is known as miscegenation than perhaps the English and etc. Speak to that issue of the difference that they saw in dealing with miscegenation and etc. I mean, speak to that as an issue.
yeah, well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of that's something students are always interested too about, obviously how the Spanish would come up with a term, mulatto, for these intermarriage, assuming that a mule then is sterile. We're two different species, a white and an Indian, that they can't have children, but it's obviously they could. Yeah, the Spanish settlement, obviously they wanted to kind of make the Indians Spanish in their own unique way, whereas the English definitely kept more of a distance. To some extent, they came with their families.
Okay.
And that's a big part.
And of course, what we're doing here, Dr. Schmeller, is to end this particular segment and to come back with this third segment that'll give you an opportunity to amplify some of the things that you're saying. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. The topic is